People don't realize that NSA was actually going deaf, had been for years. Here's why. You have to remember the rise of the internet.
Welcome back. I'm here with Thomas Drake. Tom, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I know it's been a while. I appreciate your patience and persistence, but here we are.
Yeah, I'm extremely excited to talk to you because we have a mutual friend, Christopher Robinson, who not many people know about, but they should. Like, the world should really know about Christopher Robinson. And that's how I became aware of you, believe it or not. And I was very intrigued by your story at NSA as a whistleblower. And at a high level, there's kind of two ways to blow the whistle. There's kind of the proper way, which I think you are the shining example of that. Like, you did everything the right way. And then there's the improper way, which is kind of the Eric Snowden way. And you can tell from the effects of that. So I don't know about you, but I get a free service by the government because his actions led, I believe, to the loss of data at PERSCOM, U.S. Personnel Command, that had all these like security clearances and things like that with personal information. And I think that was hacked by the Chinese. And as a result, I get this identity protection service free from the government that alerts me if there's anything that has come up. So
Same here. I actually was part of that list. The OPM, if you're talking OPM, I ended up being notified. Also, information regarding my security background as well.
Yeah. So thank you for, you did at great personal, like not just great personal risk, but great personal cost. So I think we're going to discuss all of that in this interview because I think the world needs to be reminded of all that. And I think you have a very nuanced understanding of it because you've been in it. So just to get started and to level set, can you provide the audience with your background? Where are you from? When did you serve in the U.S. Air Force? What did you do in the Air Force? All that good stuff.
Well, one, I'm an American, and I'm actually a natural-born American. Given a lot of controversy these days, I was actually born on a military base, Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, Cato Parish. And my father, World War II veteran, flew missions for the OSS, ended up in the Strategic Air Command. That's where he met my mother, and that's where I was born in 1957. So for a number of years when I was younger, did a lot of, I was a military brat. So we were going from base to base. So Texas, ended up in England, this is the very late 50s. And then he ended up right before the Cuban Missile Crisis, retired after 20 years. And I was living in Texas at the time. And then he moved to Vermont. So the rest of my upbringing took place in Vermont, a republic for 14 years before it joined the Union as the 14th state after the first 13 colonies, the original 13 colonies. So went to school in Vermont, even New York, because I was lived on the border of New York, and did a whole number of interesting odd jobs. I won't go into great detail on that, but spent a couple of years just sort of figuring out who I was and what this world was all about, and had a lot of interesting experiences as a teenager, and ended up, I was working in an apple orchard and made a choice, this upstate New York, where I was living at the time, to join the military. And so I ended up going to the enlistment station for the Air Force, one of the enlistment stations it was actually Plattsburgh, but, ended up in Albany, take all the ASVAB tests. And it turns out they had a certain test that would determine if you qualified or met the thresholds for the classified cryptolinguistics Air Force specialty code, AFSC. And I ended up going through all the training for cryptolinguists, both language school out in Monterey, California, Foreign Language Center, DLI, Defense Language Institute. I ended up in tech training in Texas at Goodfellow Air Force Base, went through survival school, including SEER, classified, super classified training as well at the top secret code word level. And then my first duty station, and that's where I was for 4 years from 81 to 85, was flying on RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft. Very interesting. I was sort of during the second phase of the Cold War, but the latter years of that second phase, flying all kinds of missions in the European theater, and lived in East Anglia of England for 4 years.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
And then got an assignment to PCS to Tucson, Arizona, and Davis-Monthan is actually the Monthan Air Force Base, where I flew in another platform, a tactical air command platform called EC-130H's Compass Call Electronic Warfare. Had an interesting almost 4 years there. Got out, was at the CIA for a short stint, doing classified all-source intelligence analysis with a specialization in national technical means, which basically means satellite-sourced intelligence of various types, primarily in the imagery space. Then was in the Navy as a intel officer, reserve, spent a number of years down at the Pentagon, the Alert Center, and the National Military Joint Intelligence Center on several different desks, including the ELINT desk and terrorism in Middle East, North Africa. That takes me all the way to 97, and going back to late 89, I actually became a contractor, a defense contractor for a number of years in various assignments. And then also did quite a bit of consulting during the go-go 90s, early aughts in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, focused on software engineering, system engineering, information technology, talking the full gamut from, design all the way to deployment. Almost moved to Silicon Valley because it was that environment. It was clearly was fascinating when I look back on it. But of course, then there was the dot bomb implosion. Of course, I'm crunching all this because a lot that occurred in between. And I was at home. This is February. Let's see, I'm just backing up now because now we're going back 24 years, almost 24 years ago. So it's going to be next month. I was sitting at home reading the classified section of the Washington Post. And there was not quite a quarter page, but it was a very large executive. It was an executive classified looking for senior level positions, advertising for senior level positions at NSA. And I applied, and we're talking, this is, there's a long history here, and I just skipped over a whole bunch of stuff, but they were looking for, because of pressure from stakeholders, that they weren't keeping up with the times and needed fresh blood and, stir up the gene pool. So I answered the ad and went through the hiring process, which was greatly accelerated. They were attempting to hire in a similar manner to high-tech corporations. So there was quite a few people that applied. They went through a winnowing down process. I ended up final two people are put in front of the very person who would ultimately be my supervisor, who was the number 3 person at the NSA, who at that time headed up the Signals Intelligence Directorate, which is really the operational side of NSA. Mm-hmm. And I got hired. And my first day on the job, reporting to my new duty station after I went through training, took the oath to support and defend the Constitution for the 5th time in my military government career, was actually 9/11.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So 9/11 really is a huge, well, even to this day, it's so incredibly present 24 plus years, almost 24 years later. There's life for me. There was life before 9/11, and then there's life after 9/11. Mm-hmm. My life is literally divided in that manner. And that began an interesting set of experiences, and that's a huge understatement, in which I was confronted by certain realities while I was there and had to make a choice, right? And I'll pause in case you have any questions in terms of sort of my quick summary of my background that actually led me. But what's important to also share is that when I was in the military, especially in the Air Force, I was on the other half of NSA, which was the cryptologic. That was the CSS. It's the other half of NSA, which is headed up by a general, a lower ranking general, where NSA itself at the time was headed up by a 3-star. But I was part of a cryptologic service element. All the services had them. At the time in the Air Force, it's different now, but at the time it was the Electronic Security Command. So I became very familiar with the outward-facing forward intelligence collection mission for SIGINT, which is or communication intelligence. Signals intelligence, combination of communications and electronic. I had a very high level clearance, of course, given access over the years to various compartments, handling caveats in terms of either source method and or the platform. Military also had SAP and SAR, so you sometimes was highly restricted in terms of access because it was mission centric or dependent on the type.
SAP, special access programs. What's SAR? Special access
required.
Okay.
Yeah. So various flavors of that, especially when you're talking operational deployment, things of that nature. That even extended to highly classified training scenarios in which you're flying in different zones or parts of different exercises. That could be red flag, green flag exercises. That could be the NTOC, the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, and various other places in missions, both U.S. and overseas. So, and then there was also, of course, the operational side, because it did have a wartime combat support role as well. So there I was, first day on the job, 9/11, and I was part of the group, thousands of people that went home, because it's clear that as things were breaking and planes in the air still, that NSA might have been a potential target. Turns out one of the targets was actually the Capitol, right? Mm-hmm. In DC. But so a whole bunch of people went home, and it was clearly this huge national security crisis of massive proportions. For me, to use a Star Trek analogy, it was a real tear in the space-time continuum, and things were going to be quite different. It turns out some things were different, and some things, unfortunately, were not. It's a very complicated set of events that then began to take place. Many of them conducted in extraordinary secrecy. And I became privy to knowing about some of these based on my own investigations, as well as people coming to me privately with huge concerns. And that in itself would take many, many hours to unfold, but I can at least summarize, right? But there's also a lot of nuances and a lot of sort of origin stories. But here I was in a very secret organization. You're talking all kinds of security, physical, electronic, specially built buildings, all kinds of electronic filters and screens, and you name it, right? And the irony, of course, there's an irony here. See, NSA was not part of the National Security Act, as I've said this publicly a number of times. People think, oh, yeah, it was part of the National Security Act in 1947. CIA, the new DOD, Air Force, right, was also in that same time period. It was not. Turns out NSA was actually created in the deepest secrecy by how? So literally by the stroke of a single pen. Mm-hmm. And who was holding the pen? President Harry S. Truman in fall of 1952. It was created as basically a hybrid DoD agency headed up by a 3-star. As it turned out, that became the 3-star position. Now it's a 4-star when they reorganized the so-called intelligence community after 9/11. So 1952 had a secret mission. The secret mission was basically to collect electronic foreign intelligence. Mm-hmm. Extraordinarily broad mission. There was very few restrictions. Now, on paper, until all kinds of revelations came forth in the 70s, whereas when I grew up as a young teenager and experienced my own civic awakening in terms of the government going off the rails, right? This is sort of another side of the so-called deep state. Yeah, the deep state went off the rails, right? Because it was using secrecy and national security as an excuse, as a cover to engage in all kinds of activities, right? Across the board, right? It's just stunning when you go back.
Yeah, like MK Ultra and all sorts
tons, right? They had CIA's Operation Chaos. You had the Army's program spying on Americans. You had NSA's Minaret and others. Some of them were long-standing, going back to the 50s, based on special arrangements with certain, like the old telegram companies. All this, there was a bunch of hearings, investigations, including the Church Committee, Pike, Bella Abzug, Rockefeller Commission, exposing just some wild stuff. I mean, we're talking, and you can cause quite a stir. In fact, this was basically the first time that people even heard about the NSA, because that was sort of the old joke: no such agency, never say anything, no secrets anymore. That sort of yeah.
Well, sometimes I wonder, it was so secret for so long, it wasn't like people didn't even know about it. Sometimes I wonder if there are other agencies like that focused on other problems that we'll talk about in a subsequent episode, like phenomenology, things like that.
CIA for one. Yep. But then even NRO, even at that, NRO was superseded. It was formed in the early 60s, right? This is the
Cuban Missile Crisis. For people who don't know, that's the National Reconnaissance Organization.
National Reconnaissance Office, yeah, which I'm very familiar with. Used to work with different aspects of them, in part because, they were spaceborne platforms. That was, had really extraordinarily advanced technology, right? But super, super, super classified, right? Still to this day, right? They're some of the most secret missions in terms of a platform, and then what they put on those platforms that exist to this day. But, eyes in the sky, to say it that way. But it, very, very high altitude and some rather strange, strange orbits, right? But it's something I had to become very familiar with, given where the other agency, as they say, where I used to work. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. All right, sort of a God's eye view, depending on what you're using and looking at, right, from high up. And that's part of the addiction, by the way. There is sort of the secrecy culture, and it can be very addicting because you, quote unquote, have special knowledge, and I know something you don't, which also extends to the various agencies and departments involved in intelligence, right? I know something you don't, but kind of hold on to it. It's sort of Scrooge with his coins. I'm going to hoard what I know, but you don't really know what I know unless I share it. But if I share it, then I don't have the power anymore because I gave it to you, right? Part of the dynamics with around 9/11 and why 9/11 even happened, right? Well, then it was used as an excuse for a whole range of things, right? Sort of I'll call it a faux false flag. This is leaving aside all the conspiracy theories, right? I've had to deal with that over the years, as you might imagine. But there's a whole lot that the government still has not answered for and has chosen to keep certain things, including certain arrangements that we had with certain countries, way off, sort of out of the public purview, right? Because, it's kind of embarrassing, right? And then you talk about power and secret authorities and all this other stuff. So there I was, right? There I was. And this gets in some really, because remember, part of the dynamic here, this massive intelligence complex was created in the years shortly after World War II. And in part to resolve the fundamental issue of, right, Pearl Harbor, we will never be electronically surprised again. So does it say, obviously a legit mission? I mean, there's a lot of the breaking of codes, which in itself was a super secret thing back in World War II.
Yeah, Bletchley,
with the help, it turns out I'm going to give him credit because I'm very familiar with the history of cryptology, with extraordinary assistance from the Poles. But it was an amazing effort, right, to break the Ultra. So what became known as Ultra. And the Germans actually thought it was unbreakable. Yeah, might have been a lot closer to unbreakable if they had thrown in the other wheel. But by the time they realized that, it was too late. Probably shortened the war, based depending on what historian you want to align with or accept in terms of sort of the hidden side, the hidden histories of World War II, may have shortened the war by a couple of years, which it's pretty significant, right, in its own right. Yeah, people don't realize, intelligence in itself is both art and science. But I was classically trained, by the way, going back to my Air Force days, and it was always about this. So this is critical, bringing it all the way up back to 9/11. My intelligence training was always focused on the duty to warn, the duty by warning to keep people out of harm's way. And especially when it came to strategic intelligence, but obviously you don't know unless you're actually monitoring tactically, surveilling tactically. And this gets into intentionality, right? You're looking for patterns. You're looking for what's outside the patterns. You're looking for what's not normal. And that's what I was trained on. It's indications and warning. We call it I and W. It's classic. I actually.
You're also looking for things that aren't happening, right? Like,
exactly.
If there's a sudden silence in radio communications, right? Like, that's a loud signal.
Yeah,
to happen, right?
We became very familiar with that without going into details. But yes, because sometimes the absence of actually told you a lot, right? When things weren't happening, told you a lot. If they went silent, as it were, right? And when and under what circumstances. Knowing the difference, by the way, between an exercise, what we refer to as a notional exercise, versus real world. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
So I have a random question about that. That raises a question.
Sure.
When you were running missions in Europe, what span of years was that?
81 to 85.
Oh, man. Do I have questions? Able Archer.
Yeah, very familiar with that period. Yes. Yep, sure was.
Okay. I'm going to ask you another quick question. You can
go ahead.
This may be highly classified. Just don't answer if it's. Lynn Buchanan. Are you familiar with who he is? The remote viewer.
No, I am not familiar with that name. I'm familiar with remote viewing, especially experiments that the CIA did.
So he's an Army. He was a sergeant at the time, military intelligence. He was based in Fort Meade, Maryland, where they had the remote viewing unit from Project Stargate. Before he was in that program, he was an intelligence, worked in intelligence, he's a sergeant. He was in Augsburg, Germany. And he alleges that around that period, he never connected it to Able Archer, but I did. So around kind of 1983-ish, the skiffs in Europe on both sides suddenly winked out. Is that something that you may or may not be familiar with, or is that because I can't corroborate that? It's not something I could ever corroborate.
I'm not familiar with the winking out. I am familiar with what actually happened.
Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, because Able Archer was huge. It was an exercise, right? It had all kinds of exercises. Reforger, right? I was part of that as well. And any number of others. Some of them were highly specialized. Some of them involved large numbers of units. But Able Archer was, because it's Cold War, European-based, although it extended elsewhere, but it was primarily European-based. Mm-hmm. But it was an exercise. And we used to have our own exercises, right? Even in terms of the RC-135 mission. And there was a couple of different platforms that I used to fly on. But Able Archer was actually an exercise. But interestingly enough, the Soviets, and there's a whole history here, a particular colonel realized that because the Soviets actually thought it was so realistic that Soviets initially thought that they were under attack preemptively. Mm-hmm. And he realized that it was notional. And it probably, and I'll just this is a what if now. This becomes the what if. Like, all right, it could have gotten really bad really fast. And he realized that it was notional. It was just an exercise. There was no preemptive launch or attack decisions that had gone out from the highest levels of the U.S. government. And once again, you could say that was one of those cases where if things had been gone differently, there might have been at least the start of a nuclear exchange. You sort of shudder, think about it. This kind of goes back to things, similar dynamics around the Cuban Missile Crisis, similar dynamics that people don't realize almost happened in Israel, Egypt. This goes back to 73. And then you have KL-007, which in itself isn't interesting because that in itself was ignored, which gets into the history of KL-007. It's extraordinarily embarrassing for NSA. But in terms of Able Archer, yeah, that's what I can share, right? Anything else that I would say would either, be speculative or I'm not in a position to say any more, right? But
what was your mission back then? Were you doing just jamming communications or were you intercepting?
The RC-135 was the peacetime aerial reconnaissance program, even though it had a wartime mission. So we're basically vacuuming up a whole lot of signals, monitoring a whole lot of different signals, right?
So it could be communications.
But you had to know, you always had to know. Well. Right. Sorry?
It could be communication signals, but it could be other signals too. Yeah. Different signatures,
Lots of, just think about the electromagnetic spectrum. We covered most of what would be the traditional electromagnetic spectrum. I had to learn a whole lot, right? The Raisin manual, as they call it, provided all kinds of information about the different, it was always updated, of course, to keep up with the different systems out there in terms of what could radiate, what could emit, what its parameters
So it could be anything from I'm probably wrong, but either ELF waves or VLF from submarine communications
all the way to super gigahertz, multiple gigahertz level, radar level.
I think
radar, microwave,
communications is in the gigahertz. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And we're talking very high. Yeah, very super narrow band. Yeah. And then
let's go back
a lot, but that's that gets into the technical side. But yeah, but we had tasking. I mean, you can't even with the technology of the day, you couldn't just take everything, right? Quote unquote, take everything, right? Even when you wanted to, you always focused on, what mattered. We had tasking, right? There was a specialized system, but we had tasking. And that tasking prioritized certain types of signals and locations even up to and including time of day. But there was
so
always,
you might
yeah,
you might
that
have
was that was the
I'm just
baseline.
making this up, but
Okay,
I'm just making this up, but you could have someone who's observing photos, right? Might, satellite photos, might notice that there were several subs that were in subpens that had left the subpens, and they might say, based on the radio spectrum, whatever it is, I can't remember if it's VLF or like ELF, whatever, but find where these subs are based on that, and then you might look. I guess a sample mission. I'm just
there's a whole range when it comes
right.
to frequency, right? HF to VLF, right? VHF to UHF and beyond, right? There's even carve outs in there depending on the type of system and I say even by international agreements, what can actually operate in that particular frequency range / band.
Right.
Yeah. Fascinating. It's fascinating, right? But it's communications. Yeah. And the thing about communications, and it's one reason why it's a huge part of the president's daily brief, because it gets into intentions. It gets into sort of the intentionality and purpose. It's even when I used to work at another agency, you couldn't always, just looking at a picture, I'll put picture in quotes, you couldn't always tell what it meant. Now, it was, again, all source. You wanted as many different ints, remember, multiple ints. But the thing with signals intelligence, the combination of communications and electronic, is it gives you a much better read on intentionality.
Right.
Where things are going, what might be underway, and there's these indicators, and we call them there's a whole lingo for that internally. So you want to know what the baseline was, sort of standard everyday operating parameters, especially peacetime, quote unquote. It's Cold War, but no, we're not talking blast fire and fragmentation in terms of the kinetic space. Okay, so you want to know what that baseline is, sort of the zero baseline. Anything outside of that, depending on what it was, then had certain thresholds for reporting. So there's a whole set of requirements around that, up to and including, if it was serious enough, had to be on the president's desk within 10 minutes from basically recognition. Point of recognition. Called a critic. It was called the critic system.
Okay. Now, I didn't mean to take us on a long detour, but going straight back to post 9/11, what kind of in the first few days, kind of when did you start to see it was, in terms of kind of when the Patriot Act passed and all that stuff, when did things start to get
well before the Patriot Act, actually, which is basically was shoved through in the middle of the night, right? And then there was a secret interpretation of it. That's a whole story in itself, because it started to lay the framework for how do you sort of legalize what was patently unconstitutional and unlawful. 9/11 never should have happened. I'm just going to say that right up front. Mm-hmm. Never should have happened. But even George Tenet, the then director of CIA since 98, said the system was blinking red. And remember, I didn't go into detail. I used to sit in the alert center as an intel officer in the Navy. I was there in 93 when they tried to drop the World Trade Center towers the first time with truck bombs.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we had the operational, basically usually an 06, sometimes 05 could fill in, but usually in 06, it was an 06 position /05.
So for people who don't know, 05 is a lieutenant colonel, or I think it's commander in the Navy, and then an 06 would be a captain in the Navy and a full bird colonel in the Army.
Yeah, flag rank, usually 06 flag rank. Yeah,
or
it reported to the J2. So the J2 typically was a 1/2-star general.
Okay, so
and he reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That was the intelligence wing, still is to this day, the intelligence wing of the military at the highest level. Yep.
Okay, so
never should have happened. Okay, systems blinking red. I remember going in the alert center. We actually issued a report saying they're serious, right? They're going to come back. So, this idea that, failure of imagination is complete I'll be polite here. Yes.
Right.
Poppycock. I like this is the word I'll use.
So, given all the signals that this was happening, why do you think someone would have had to make a decision, or just an acquiescence if no formal decision was made? Why let such a thing happen? What?
Well, this is interesting, and this is where I continue. People don't realize the NSA was actually going deaf, had been for years. Here's why. You have to remember the rise of the internet. Internet existed well before public internet. We're talking the early 90s. I remember the organization that I support as a contractor. I actually built the first web page for that organization using basically the pre-release version. It was an alpha release of the
HTML
hypertext transport protocol. Yes.
Yeah.
That was all pretty much manual. There were no tools, I was using editors.
Oh, I remember making my own web pages. When it first came out back in the mid-90s.
I miss those days in some ways because, it was...
Where you go to another website and you copy their code, and that's how you learn. That's how you learn HTML. Right.
Oh, yeah. 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 Pick and shovel and just reiterate. And that was it was pretty cool those days. They really were. Right. But so where was I? Sorry.
So the NSA was going deaf.
Oh, yeah. Going deaf. So here's why. NSA got really, really good over decades of the Cold War, and even, remember, it was designed basically to mirror the threats that we faced during the Cold War, the traditional great power threats, primarily Soviet Union, to be honest.
Right.
But it had a worldwide mission. And these are primarily, this is oversimplifying because, push to talk, right?
Right.
Analog, not digital, right? And, anything that was on a wire, as we would say, or anything that was in the ether, you could grab it, right? Snag it, store it, look at it various ways. But in terms of volume, right? And there obviously were hard targets, some are highly encrypted ones, right? That would require additional processing or long-term analysis to break, etc., depending. We had a catalog. I have to say it that way. I haven't used that word in a while, but catalog of all these
different
systems.
Targets. Right.
Yeah, you kind of knew the lay of the land. You knew the environment. I wouldn't call it target rich as much as there was all kinds of radios out there, just transmitters of various types. When the internet exploded, it began this extraordinary increase in just the sheer amount of data. I mean, just unbelievable. Because of the form in which you're now talking packets, right? Packet-based communication, right? The sort of the internals of the signal, right? The messaging. And there's a whole fascinating history in terms of just internet itself, right? Which really was a consortium government university. I still have on a single sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11, the original internet, right? DARPA, ARPA. But so what do you do, right? NSA is confronted by a real challenge. And it was known. This was a known challenge. This was not unknown. It wasn't like 9/11 caught NSA by surprise based on, oh my God, we'll get into that here shortly. But what do you do to figure out what matters in a sea of digital data? Well, here's where they went off beam, right? Because their traditional method was, we'll just catalog it, pull it, store it, right?
And then analyze
there's
it later.
There's data, what they call data in motion. There's data at rest, right? Data at rest typically it could be temporary, but typically is what ends up in databases, right? Depending on how you parse it. Data in motion is kind of the live stuff, or in the transport layers, right? Depending on the system. So their answer, this problem is so big. And they wrestled with this for a while. There's all kinds of studies, which are actually quite damning of NSA. Just sitting there staring at their institutional navels, right? What do we do? What do we do, right? Because, it's not the Cold War. Who's the real threat, right? Well, 93, that's kind of to give you a strong indication of where non-state actor threats coming from. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Well, this problem is so big, a la Manhattan level, right? We need to go out to the military, industrial intelligence complex. And this was a decision made at the highest levels in the late 90s, especially when General Michael V. Hayden came along, who's an interesting character and very central, especially during the early years of the post 9/11 set of events, in which I got completely tied up in. He's also central, in part central, is one of the main characters, even in what happened to me. Leaving that aside for the moment, what do you do? Let's just go buy the solution. Let's not take, again, that famous American phrase from earlier parts of the industrial age. Let's, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
Let's just go buy it because it's such a big problem. There's so much data. It's a big data problem, requires big money. As if big money equals this. It's not. It's not at all. In fact, the historical examples, and I'm talking skunkworks level, but in the signals intelligence space, it was these very small research labs, right, off in the corner that were solving the really, and had been for years, some still unsung, right? It'll take many years before they're declassified, breakthroughs that occurred in secret in most cases. There might be contractors involved, but it was always led by the government, putting systems into play, right, that provided for the common defense, to go back to the Constitution, the preamble, one of the two main pillars of government's responsibility to the country, the people. The other one is, of course, promote the general welfare, which has been taken way out of context, right? So providing for the common defense, right, was usually a make solution, not a buy solution. But no, they went wholesale buy. And we're talking, well, we spent billions, that'll be our answer because it's a big problem, so we're going to have to spend a lot of money. Well, if you're a contractor, you're perversely incentivized to not solve the problem. You're perversely incentivized to keep the problem going and all the money flowing. That is attributed to Bill Binney, one of my former NSA colleagues, right? And so it just becomes this huge, we're talking remarkably, vulnerable to massive fraud, waste, and abuse. So I got to know a lot of those skunkworks projects. And NSA had made the choice. So, in the meantime, even though they were just, we'll just take as much as we can. And it's true, even back 25 years ago plus, the cost of storage for digital data was dropping rapidly. You could store just offline tons and tons, or even online, tons and tons of stuff. And we'll sort it out later by, figuring out Rube Goldberg's search routines to go back in and put it all back together again, which is Humpty Dumpty. This actually is fundamental. You got to go, Lewis Carroll. I have not shared this in a long, long time, but I'll mention it now. Lewis Carroll had a lot to say about how because remember the famous, children's, story about Humpty Dumpty. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not put him back together again after he fell off. Yeah, he's an egg. You can't, that's what's interesting, right? Once the egg cracks, try to put it back. So why not just keep the egg, right? You don't have to break out all this deconstruction approach, unfortunately, right? Deconstruct. You lose the context in which the data originated. It's fundamental, right? So this was a huge, and there was, I'm telling you, this was not like a surprise. Were there people vigorously pushing back on this approach? Yes. Because it was famous Einstein, right? Tried the same thing over and over again, expecting this different result, but you get the same result to just sort of recast is saying.
Yeah, definition of
that's
insanity,
a different
right.
form of insanity, right? Why would you keep trying to do the same thing? Oh, because that's what we were good at. Yeah, I admit you were really good in the legacy space, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that type of solution, which works so well for so many decades to support the common, provide for the common defense, is going to work in the digital age. You got to come up with a different approach. But that would mean reinventing how you, quote unquote, what they call the intelligence cycle. You'd have to reinvent it in terms of how you process data.
Is that kind of what led to the creation of the technology that led to Google by CIA with search and things like that? Because that started around this same period, right?
Yeah, well, then that's a whole side story, but it's more than a side story when it comes to the origins of Google, the original monies that were put up, and there was these special corporations that were stood up. CIA had several in which you would partner, and there was others that people don't talk about a whole lot. Some of them involving some universities, right, where you would actually have seed money. And the seed money would then be used to, quote unquote, solve certain challenge problems. Google was one of them in part, right? Of course, it's just, a massive monopolistic, entity now. That
no longer actually utilizes search. It's more,
it's a surveillance platform. Let's be real.
Well, it's a surveillance platform, and it also shapes. It's like a shaping reality platform too, right?
That gets back to messaging. Communications is vulnerable to misuse, abuse of information for sometimes less than positive purposes, right? You can use it to manipulate, which ultimately, if you're talking the worst form of manipulation, and I'm going to just use the word, is propaganda, right? Some people call disinformation, but propaganda always has seeds of truth. Some cases it has substantial truth. It's just the way that it's wrapped, the way that it's carried, the way that it's stated, the way that it's emphasized, reemphasized, typically through multiple levels of repetition, right, of various types.
Well, here's one you might not.
In-Q-Tel was the one I was familiar with. Just so you know. Go ahead.
Well, I'll give you an example of this repetition thing, and it shouldn't be controversial, but it is. So this is constantly repeated on NPR, like the most prestigious. Well, I should say the New York Times is kind of the one exception, but most Americans, I would say probably 99% of them, believe that we never found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? And by weapons of mass destruction, I'm not talking nuclear weapons because that often gets conflated, but that is a subset of weapons of mass destruction. Same thing with biological weapons, that's a subset. But there's an article in October, I want to say 2014 maybe, in the New York Times. It's called like the secret casualties of Saddam's chemical weapons program. Now, while it's true that he did not, at least based on public data, that he did not have like an ongoing chemical weapons program, he certainly had stockpiles of unutilized sarin munitions. I think they were in that article, it's like 2,400. But so it is true that we did find weapons of mass destruction. Yet in the public zeitgeist, it's like we never found them. We never found weapons of mass destruction. And to this day, the only explanation I can come up with is that when we found them, we didn't want the enemy to know that, hey, there are these depots that we haven't found. We haven't found all of them in Iraq. So we don't want to tell the world that, yes, Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, so all these terrorists go and try to find the rest of them. So we just played with that fiction. And now it's like public knowledge that we never found weapons of mass destruction. So I think that's one example. And again, I have friends who were like EOD guys who like detonated these things. Like they were in theater and they found them. So anyway, that's, I think, one such example.
I have inside knowledge and all that. That's again a whole nother conversation, but it works both ways. And part of the ways that it worked was an excuse. May not have been active programs. I agree with that, but it was an excuse to preemptively invade. Right? I have to say that. And
100%, 100%.
Saddam had nothing at all to do with 9/11. But remember what the fear was that was being propagandized in the American public. The fear was, and remember, you remember Rice would say, who wants to see, a mushroom cloud, right? Because that was, they're reconstituting their nuclear program sitting there. Even that was a stretch because the Israelis had wiped out essentially what was, their active, reactor.
In Osiric in like 1980, right?
Wiped it out, right? Just obliterated it, right? The thing that he did have was this massive stockpile, and you can say, well, inert, but a lot of the stuff, sitting around in various caches. I mean, he had actually employed this against the Iranians, right, during their conflict.
Yeah. And many believe he may have employed it against us in the first Gulf War, using the oil fires to mask it.
Yeah, that's the earlier, right? Yeah, that was a more legitimate, although there were people pushing then Bush to say, hey, got to go all the way to Baghdad, right? But that was interesting enough, a more limited operation. That's a whole nother set of... Yeah,
I'm not going to I'm not going to ask you about that.
No, it's okay. No, it's just... I just know the intelligence did not support active. There was no active. There wasn't. There was a single source, right? There was a single source, and it turns out that single source was highly biased and, had their own intentions involved in all of this, right? So...
I want to ask you...
Curveball was a single source. Yeah.
Okay, because I think some of the remote viewers in Stargate also saw something like that. That's where I've heard about it, not from Curveball. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I don't want to get distracted.
No, it's anyway, okay. You were saying, there's a lot. There's a lot here, and you're talking. That's why I say it just so happened. I happened to be involved or was in at the highest levels, practically the very... Every supervisor I had reported to the top deck, right? The civilian head. So it was a pretty senior position. So it is interesting when I look back on it, and I had wide purview, as it turned out. And again, we don't even have time, even the extended time we're involved right now with this interview. I don't have the time to go into all what my full set of responsibilities were when I was there. But just know right after that. So against all that backdrop, right?
Right.
9/11's happened. It was not supposed to happen. We were supposed to. See, this gets into what was a fundamental responsibility of NSA as part of the larger indications and warning system, which was quite vast. Well, there's all these equity issues, they call it. There's all these stovepipes, silos, etc. Yeah, that's all a factor too. Like if, the Rudyard Kipling poem, if you're not sharing what you know about the thing, and remember the three blind men, right? One's at the back of really it's kind of the elephant, one's in the middle, and one's by the there's a trunk, but they're not sharing. They're making up. They're basically limited in what they can say about the thing that they're quote unquote actually touching, because they're not sharing their information. This is really, really critical. You need to share the critical elements of information to provide a much better picture. It's still an art in part, but how do you make an informed decision? This gets back to like the whole decision-making system. I'll just say that it was corrupted, right? It was corrupted in part by just how it ended up falling into disarray. And then you get all the internal political deep state issues, right? So it never should have happened. Almost 3,000 people are murdered that day. It's a burden that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, because not just because I was there, not just because I was there, but even prior, right? Not just because I knew, I was there in 93, but it never should have happened. But that's a what if, because it did.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that the response would be, we really need, and by the way, as a side note, which is not really a side note, counterterrorism, all other claims aside, was not a priority after Bush was elected. It was not. It was a backwater. You did not get promoted. You tend to get stuck. There was a very small team. I got to meet that team, got to know that team really, really well. A very small team, a counterterrorism team at NSA, course, that dramatically changed after 9/11, right? So this gets into, if the tree falls in the forest, remember, system is blinking red, but if there's no one there to see it, let alone hear it, let alone keep track of it, right? Well, did it happen? Yeah. Well, you can ignore the data. You can ignore because you might have to do something, right? So part of the problem that had emerged, especially in the digital age, when it came to intelligence, was NSA was increasingly only reacting or not acting at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being proactive. How do you prevent, preclude, disrupt? Right? So here we are. It was a fundamental failure. The highest levels of NSA, as well as others in the government, said, we can't admit to the failure. We really can't. We just need to make Americans feel safe again, which is not actually in the Constitution. Feel safe again? That's a psychological thing, right? To make you feel safe again. I mean, I can walk outside and you get hit by a meteor shower, right? I could, right? Tree could fall. It happens, right? Even in the hyper-local, right? So they decided to begin a cover-up, essentially, and go into deep denial. The workforce is people on the front lines doing the real work, both local headquarters, all the satellite offices scattered across the area, plus NSA's own sites, both U.S. and overseas, of various types and kinds, both some semi-open, some deeply embedded, right, way off the grid. Knew that we had failed. They knew we had fundamentally failed to keep people out of harm's way. So there's all these meetings that took place. I'm just going to compress, right? All these meetings that began to take place in the days right after 9/11. What else could the government do? And this was a fateful decision on the part of the government. And I found out about it shortly after they made the decision. They were going to take the enormous power of NSA, which was always outward facing, foreign intelligence, non-U.S. persons under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act passed in 1998 because of all the scandals and everything that emerged, all the disclosures in the 70s that I mentioned earlier with all those different investigations and commissions. So they made a decision, a fateful decision, to turn the power of NSA on U.S. networks.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which which is a separate site. And there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.